One of the key components that is essential in the cloud is the concept of virtualization. Now, when you're having virtualization in the cloud, this offers the opportunity for services like multi-tenancy. Not just that, also the allocation of resources. And remember, the key components and essential characteristics in cloud is this concept of orchestration and automation. But before going off into the cloud and establishing virtual machines or running any kind of service, let's kind of do this first on our local machine to understand what happens when we do this on the cloud. So for this demo, you're going to need a couple of requirements. The first is you can utilize VMware Workstation Player. This is free. If you don't want to use VMware Workstation, you can also use VirtualBox. If you're using a Mac, you're going to want to use UTM. And just a note, if you're running virtualization on a Mac, if you have an M1, M2 chip or higher, you're probably going to likely run into issues creating a virtual machine. Also, on a note for Mac, don't use UTM that's off the Apple Store. Just make sure you download it off the website. But anyways, in this particular example, we're going to use Workstation Player 17, and we'll go ahead and create an Ubuntu desktop. So a couple things to note. First thing is when we're dealing with virtualization, there's something known as the hypervisor, which is essentially the software tool, if you will, that allows virtualization of our hardware. So in my particular machine, I, I believe it's about uh, 2 CPUs that I can allocate to any virtual machine, plus about 4 GB of RAM that I can allocate to a virtual machine. What I mean by that is depending on the number of CPUs that I have on my machine, let's say, for example, I have 8, I have to make sure that how many I have that I can actually allocate. And remember, when you have something on-prem, you're limited to the resources that you have on your physical machine versus on the cloud. There's a bunch of hardware that you can utilize. So in our example, I'm just going to go ahead and fire up our virtual machine work player station. You can see I already have a couple of machines, but in this particular example, I'm going to create a new one. Now I'm going to go ahead and select that I will install the operating system later. And here I'm going to select what kind of operating system I want. In this case, I'm going to be creating an Ubuntu desktop machine. So I'm just going to leave it as a Linux Ubuntu 64-bit. Now, one important thing to note about virtualization is that we have to then select where we're going to be essentially keeping our file. One thing I would like to note though is that storing it on your OneDrive may not be ideal because if your OneDrive is limited in storage, you'll run into issues. Also, if your OneDrive is not online, then you're not going to be able to access your virtual machine. So always make sure you have it on the C drive when you're selecting the location. Now, the other thing too is you're going to probably want to also have it in a specific folder in your C drive. So in my particular case, I created a Cloud Demo VM folder where my virtual machine is going to be residing inside my C drive. The other thing worth noting is that how we're going to be putting this into our computer. In this case, I'm probably going to be using this virtual machine, so I'm just going to be giving it an amount of size of 20 gigs. This is going to be the storage space that's available. If I'm going larger, for example, like 100 gigabytes or even wider than that, I would want to consider splitting this up into multiple files. But in this case, because it's pretty small, I'm going to allocate this in a single file. And in fact, I'm actually going to be, even though the recommended size is 20 gigs, you don't need that much for a desktop machine. I guess it just depends how much storage you're going to want to be putting into it. When you're dealing with operating systems like Kali Linux or even Parrot OS, you can even go for much, much smaller sizes. Now, before we finish this, we're going to want to customize the hardware, and this is where we're going to be making specifications for our selection. So you'll notice for memory, we select how much memory we're going to want to allocate. Now, remember, this is going to be contingent as to how much RAM you have, and if you're not too sure, look into your device configurations and settings. If you only have 4 gigs of RAM, you cannot give 4 gigs of RAM. However, you have 16 gigs of RAM. Just look at how much your uh, device is using. So, for example, let's say you have 8 gigs of RAM, but you're only utilizing 8. Then in that case, you definitely have a buffer to be able to allocate 4, which is just going to put you at the mark of 12 for your total usage in your device. So take in consideration of how much you have available. Same thing when it comes to the number of processors and CPUs that you have. In our case, my machine is using the an Intel chip. So in my case, I'm going to want to go ahead and select the virtualized IT, EPT, or AMD RVI. Most likely, you're going to be having an Intel or AMD chip. So go ahead and select that. But an important note on this when we're talking about virtualization engine. In your BIOS, you may potentially by default not have virtualization enabled. So this is something that you're going to have to enable. Additionally, you may also encounter memory integrity in Windows that could affect your virtualization. So make sure you check whether you have that on and off. And whichever one you do have, if you do have memory integrity that's on, just know that you may have some system performance issues. It might slow down a bit. But also just ensure that you have virtualization enabled in your BIOS and your hypervisors enabled as well too. Now, for most everything else, we're going to be leaving this as default settings when it comes to our network adapter, our USB controller, sound display. Just remember that when it comes to the network adapter, there's different ways to be able to share your network. Because remember, we're creating essentially a virtual computer within our machine. And as you can see, there's a couple of different options there. We can create a specified network. We can go with host only, where it's a private network shared with the host, or we can use the shared host IP. In this case, I'm just going to go with NAT, network address translation. So just sharing the host IP address. But the critical part here is that we need to now upload an image. And what do we mean by that? Well, remember in the good old days where you would buy essentially computer programs and you would get a CD. Well, we don't really have CDs anymore. And if you look at modern day laptops, the CD drive has been completely removed. So we still need some way to be able to store the image or essentially the data of the operating system that we're going to want to utilize. So you might, I'll probably use this as an example with like gamers. If you remember the early days of video games, you would have to put in a CD to be able to play the game. Now, most video games are downloaded via the cloud. Either you go onto Steam and you buy and download the game, even through the Xbox store or even the PlayStation store, you go in and you download the games now. But what happens is that you need to download and have the image or essentially the data of what you're trying to upload. Same thing with an operating system. If you've ever tried booting straight off of the BIOS, you're able to select how you're going to be booting off your machine from. And if you're essentially putting in a new image, it's always going to be asking you, well, where is this image resource? And when we're talking about image, we're talking about this, the ISO file or an optical disk image. And essentially, you can think of this as a virtual CD. This is essentially what we're going to be mounting onto our machine that's going to be having the data. So in the beginning of this demo, I mentioned that you're going to need an ISO file, and there's a couple ones you can get. For example, like in Kali Linux, if you want to run a Kali Linux virtual machine, you can download the ISO file. Same thing with Ubuntu, you can download the Ubuntu desktop image as well too. You'll notice that they're pretty heavy in size. So for example, the latest stable version of Ubuntu is roughly at 6 gigs. Here in Kali Linux, it's at 3.8 gigs. I already have these downloaded on my machine, but make sure you have them because essentially at this point, when we select our image file, it's to the equivalent of essentially putting a CD in that's going to be having the storage. But in this case, it's virtualized and we're using a disk image file that's going to essentially be helping us boot off or start up the virtual machine. So wherever you have it stored, just make sure that you have it in that particular directory that you want. In my case, I have a folder of images and I have my Ubuntu image that I've selected, just to show you kind of a couple of different images that I have off my OneDrive. But remember, I'm storing the machine on my C drive. So once we have our configurations, we'll set that up. We'll go ahead and finish that. And you'll see that we get our virtual machine that's being created here. Probably one thing I missed there was just giving this a updated name. So I'm just going to go ahead and edit my machine settings here. Oops, sorry. You can actually just do that directly. Close that. You can actually just do this directly on the machine here. And in my case, if you have your VMware workstation just fail, don't worry, you can just close it, restart, and you'll have your devices already in place. So In my case, I'm just going to rename this as to what I want it to be, and I'll just give it the name my cloud demo machine. Okay, and let's go ahead and fire this up. So right now, it's just letting us know of removable devices, particularly my camera that's connected to my computer. I'm not going to worry about that for now, but you'll see that now we have a startup. Now, an important note is that you'll notice that we have our virtual machine window here, and then we have our operating system, our host machine on the outside. Just be aware that if you click inside the virtual machine environment, it's probably going to lock in your mouse and keyboard. You can just use Control A to be able to escape that. In our case, we're just going to go ahead and continue with trying or installing Ubuntu. So I'm going to select that, press enter. And we have a successful machine that's booting up. So for this process, I am going to be pausing and stopping the recording kind of as the installation goes in, because this could take a couple of minutes. But the important thing is just to kind of follow the steps. And remember, what we are doing here is we are creating a virtual machine on our host machine. The way I like to describe that is kind of like Christopher Nolan's movie, A Dream Within a Dream. In this case, we are creating a computer within a computer. Now, the reason why I like doing this demonstration of creating a virtual machine on your host machine is because I want to expose you to how virtual machines are created manually, because then essentially when we go onto the cloud, when we create virtual machines, this manual process, which you see can take a couple of minutes and take some time, is going to be done automatically and automated by the cloud. Even now, you can see, it's working and it's taking its sweet time, but this 5-10 minute process that we're about to go through is going to be a matter of maybe a minute, 2 minutes or less when we're working with cloud services. But again, the key thing is, don't get too caught up on the details. The main thing I'm trying to illustrate here is just how we create a virtual machine on our machine. And remember, when we're creating virtual machines on the cloud, how all of this gets automated, right? Just through a management console with requests that become API keys that then get translated and sent over to the cloud service provider to then create a machine on us on the cloud. In this case, we're not creating anything on the cloud, we're just creating a virtual machine. But remember, everything that happens on the cloud is virtualized for us. Anyways, let's proceed with our installation. Here, I'm going to go ahead and move forward with a full installation. So I'm going to install Ubuntu. I'm going to select English as the established language. And here, I'm going to actually move forward with a minimal installation. And yes, I'll download updates while installing Ubuntu. Now for this part, we're going to go ahead and select Erase Disk and install Ubuntu and install now. Remember, when we are erasing the disk, we're only erasing the allocated space that we've selected. In this case, it's going to be the 20 gigabytes of storage that I've allocated for this machine. It's not going to be erasing my entire host machine. However, if you've done a different configuration or for whatever reason you're overriding your entire drive, well, that's on you. Just make sure you don't do that. And the only way you can make sure you do that is just by allocating a selected amount of space. So if you followed this demo exactly to the T, you're just allocating 20 gigabytes of storage, and the erase, it's going to be erasing essentially just clearing a blank space of storage. You're going to want to select the closest region that you're in, so that way you get the most recent updates, and then go ahead and select and create your username, password, etc. Once you've created your password, you'll see right now the installation is proceeding and it's in the process of getting completed. So now we just kind of sit back and let it do its thing. Now, as this is loading, I do want to talk about essentially just storage space and what we've done. I do get the question sometimes of, well, what happens with my storage space? If I gave it 20 gigabytes, is it going to be always using those 20 gigabytes? And what about my RAM? So let's talk about that for a bit. You'll see on my C drive, I roughly have about 476 gigabytes total, right? Windows is a very heavy operating system. So even the same thing for RAM. If you have 16 gigabytes of RAM, there's going to be something like 0.7 or 0.3 gigs of RAM that is utilized. Even with this PC, when you buy a PC and it says, oh, you have 500 gigabytes of storage, the reality is you only walk out with, like in my case, 476. And the reason for that is because again, Windows is a very heavy operating system. There's a lot of storage space that's taken up from the operating system itself. But you can see I have 273 gigabytes that are available. And so when I allocated 20 gigabytes, I essentially took 20 gigabytes of my storage that's available and that I can spare for my machine. And that's why you have to check your machine configurations and your machine settings. Likewise, so essentially what I use and whatever I store on this virtual machine, it's only going to allow me to fill up to 20 gigabytes. At that point, my resource is going to be full. And if I want to expand beyond that, then I have to reallocate my resources. And you can see, I mean, I, I, I have roughly 273 gigabytes to spare. So if I always need to add more storage, really the reality is 273 is going to be my limit because that's how much I have of free space on this host machine. Likewise with my RAM, you have to check how much RAM you have available with how much you can provide. In my particular example, you'll see that I only have 16 gigs of RAM available. Again, remember, Windows uses quite a bit of space, even when it comes to your volatile memory. It uses by default already 3 gigs of RAM, so I only get 15.7 that's available. And you can see that I'm inching up pretty close to there. You do want to be careful when you're running virtual machines, and especially depending on the performance of your machine. Like I know, for example, with my machine, I can certainly comfortably run one virtual machine at any given point. But if I start running two, three, or even four, I'm going to have some system performance issues. And of course, if your CPU reaches to a point and a threshold that's not available for resources, then your system's just going to crash. So I can comfortably add 4 gigabytes of RAM because I know I'm going to be inching up towards 15 gigs, but I have enough of a buffer so I can continue using my machine comfortably. But you'll see, and you can even use this your task manager as you're creating your virtual machines. As you're running your virtual machine, the moment you stop your virtual machine, your RAM goes down. When you start it up, your RAM is going to go back up based as to the amount of uh, RAMs that you allotted to your machine. Now, for your storage machine, that's not going to be as fluctuating as your RAM, where you know what you're using is what's going to be provided. Remember, for this particular installation, you've allocated 20 gigs of storage. When we go on to the cloud, you'll see that there's similar storage configurations where you're going to be able to select how much storage you want uh, and and how much RAM you want, and that's going to fluctuate your price and usage. So after a couple of minutes, you can see that the machine is created. We'll go ahead and restart this now. And remember, this restart is not for your host machine. It's just for the virtual machine. And you'll see that it'll kind of do its thing, reboot, and then we have a fully operating system for Ubuntu that's going to be available for us to utilize. Now, just a note, I do also create this virtual machine not only as a demonstration of virtualization on a local level, but also because when we make SSH keys and connect to our cloud machines, or even when we're working with specific APIs, um, we can utilize this machine to do whatever we like. And I think that's one of the nice things about virtualization, even both locally or on the cloud, is that I can do pretty much anything I want on this host machine, install anything that I like, and I'm not going to necessarily have any. Well, I'm not going to say no repercussions for my main machine, but at least if let's say I get tired of using this machine, or I don't necessarily need it anymore. The nice thing about this is that I can just delete it and then move on and get on with anything else. The other thing I really like about virtual machines is that you can always pause them at any point. So for example, here I'm going to fire up a web browser, and then let's just say for whatever reason I need to pause my work. I can always just pause the machine, and you'll see that it completely stopped there, but then I can reboot it back to its same state. So for example, here I have my virtual machine, and when I select this, you'll notice that it's actually been kind of frozen into this state. And if I were to run it again, it's going to boot back to the place that I was before. So again, kind of like the nice thing of virtual machines, you have that kind of flexibility of kind of pausing and running. Difference here, though, is that we haven't pushed anything in the cloud just yet. All we did was just create a virtual machine on our computer, which we can then utilize as we're connecting and making SSH keys, and even when we're doing web-based applications or just kind of tinkering around. We can do all that tinkering on here. Likewise, when we connect to the cloud, we can use this machine to be able to connect to our cloud virtual machines. Just remember, when we do move on to the cloud, you get charged for what you utilize. So just recapitulating what we went over here. In this particular example, we created a virtual machine on our host machine. Remember to be aware as to what method you're going to be creating your virtual machine in, as well as how much storage and space you have available. Should you have any questions, please send an email or just reach out to me with any inquiries. Thank you.